Hello and welcome. You're watching To The Point. In the last 5 days, 18 students in Kerala have been arrested for lampooning and criticizing the Prime Minister. They've been charged with defamation under the Indian Penal Code. Though these developments have not received the attention they deserve, they are deeply worrying because they threaten freedom of expression. And many ask, is this the thin end of a much wider wedge? That's the debate in part 2. But first, over the weekend, the Prime Minister warned that tough decisions and strong measures are needed to tackle the economic situation facing the country. Prime Minister Modi said these steps could dent his popularity, but that would not deter him. So tonight we ask, what sort of measures is the Prime Minister hinting at, and what would happen if he ducks them? And now joining me to discuss what steps the Prime Minister should take to tackle the economy is former Chief Economic Advisor Shankar Archarya, the Chairman of Triveni Engineering and former CII President Dhruv Sawhney, the Editor of the Business Standard A.K. Bhattacharya, and the Mumbai Bureau Chief of the Financial Times, James Crabtee. Dr. Shankar Archarya, Prime Minister Modi has said tough decisions and strong measures are necessary over the next 1 or 2 years to bring financial discipline. And he added, I'm well aware that my steps may dent the immense love the country has given me. In your eyes, is this a reassuring sign the Prime Minister is willing to bite tough bullets, which many believe should have in fact been bitten a lot earlier?
To me, Karan, it is very reassuring that Prime Minister has said this. I was in fact a little concerned when I heard or read the President's address in Parliament last week, because there wasn't that sense of urgency by way of taking corrective economic and financial action. I mean, one has to admit or grant that this government has inherited an in tray from hell, a phrase I think that was used when Obama first became president. I think on the economic side that's very much the case. You know, there's hardly any growth in industry, inflation double digits for 5 years in consumer price terms. You know, there's a food problem possibly appearing in food inflation terms. Employment, we don't have data, but it suggests that not many new jobs are being created. And yes, external finances could come under pressure from what's happening in Iraq and oil prices and so forth. And there was a huge confidence problem in all of industry and businesses. And that, I think, has been solved. But other things require policy action.
Now, Dhruv Sawhney, in contrast to what you've heard from Dr. Shankar Archarya, the Congress party this evening accused the Prime Minister of hypocrisy. They say his call for tough decisions and strong measures suggests that he was lying when he said, "Achhe din aale wale hain." How do you respond to the way Congress has commented on the Prime Minister's statement?
No, I think that's not a correct reading of the situation, because the Prime Minister has come into a situation which is very, very difficult. He has got a problem in growth. Industry has a lot of lack of confidence, and most projects are put on the back burner. The expectation from him is to have quick results. So now there is definitely a feeling amongst us in industry that things are going to get better. But I think his problem is that he has to take some short-term measures to actually get investment flowing, and then some longer-term measures to correct the anomalies of the economy. And I think, you know, a couple of things that I hope that we will see soon are something on the labor front and on the construction industry, because that's the first place where jobs can be created. So I think he has to take some short and long-term measures, but certainly I do think that brighter days are ahead.
Let's then come, Mr. Bhattacharya, to some of the tough steps that are needed. We don't know whether the Prime Minister actually contemplates taking them, but let's try and work out an analytical agenda of what it is that he should be thinking of, because the economy needs it. And first, let's start with the budget. What does he need to do to ensure that the fiscal deficit looks credible? The UPA, as you know, suppressed it by a combination of slashing expenditure and postponing payments, which surely is not sustainable. So what do you think he needs to do with the fiscal deficit in mind?
Well, you have to first understand the day, precise day when he made this statement. This was on Saturday, and by Saturday the Iraq crisis had reached a point where the oil prices had already reached a 5-month high. And I think the first critical decision he has to take in this budget to rein in the fiscal deficit would be on the fuel prices front. And I think the first important step he must send out, and the signal he must send out to this country, is by making the fuel price adjustments, particularly in the diesel, in kerosene, and also in liquefied petroleum gas. So unless I think these fuel price reforms agenda is not fulfilled in this budget, I think whatever he may do in other areas, long term or medium term, I think the first big message has to go out on the fuel prices front. And which is why I suspect he is worrying that these decisions will indeed hurt his constituency, which is largely the urban India, and that's why he is saying that it will dent his popularity. And I think it's an event manager's statement where he understands that he must break the bad news without creating any surprise. If you have bad news, you must not do it with a surprise, but if you have good news, you can surprise the people.
Now, if I recall correctly, your paper today suggested that something the Prime Minister needs to do urgently is A, to allow diesel prices to increase steadily to a point where, in fact, the subsidy is wiped out, and secondly, that he should, on the LPG front, go back to the original formula of just 6 cylinders per household per year and not the further increase of 6 that Rahul Gandhi insisted upon. Do you think that because he has a majority in Parliament and doesn't really need to worry in the Lok Sabha at any rate, he will push ahead with these? Do you think he'll bite this bullet, even though it's a politically tough one? A quick answer on that, Mr. Bhattacharya.
Well, this is an administrative decision. I don't think he has to worry about either his strength in the Lok Sabha or in the Rajya Sabha. He can do it with an executive order, and it will not take much time either. So I think if he has got his economic agenda in the right place, he should do it without any further delay.
James Crabtee, when the UPA government passed the food security bill last year, there was a lot of concern in the Western media and particularly amongst Western investors that this was in fact going to entail enormous expenditure. There were calculations in the Indian press that suggested we could be talking about subsidies of 1.3 lakh crore, going upwards all the way up to 3 lakh crore if we go by some of the figures Ashok Gulati put out at the time. Will foreign investors be looking for a reining in of the food subsidy potential bill as well?
Yes, I think they probably will, Karan. I mean, I rather agree with your first speaker that Mr. Modi has not done very much to prepare the ground with the electorate for these potentially radical changes he's introducing. And if all he's talking about is what your previous speaker discussed, namely reining in fuel subsidies and reducing kerosene, I think that's basically what people are expecting, and that will be a business as usual budget. So for something truly radical to emerge, he needs to tackle issues like food subsidies and the public distribution system, which require much more far-reaching change and could be potentially much more unpopular. But if you're not going to do that when you've got this new mandate right at the beginning of your term of office, when exactly are you going to do it? So I mean, I think a lot of foreign investors would be looking for him to do that as a test of whether he will be a radical and reforming Prime Minister.
Now, Dr. Archarya, as a former chief economic advisor, you know better than most the tough decisions are always best taken at the start of a term, not halfway or certainly not towards the end of it. But this time round at the start of the term, Prime Minister Modi faces the prospect of a bad monsoon. So far from being able to cut subsidies, will he be under pressure to give an agricultural stimulus to the country, which might be very contrary to what the economy can withstand?
Well, I don't think there's much hope for an agricultural stimulus. On the positive side, I would say that one of the few good things that Mr. Modi's government has inherited is large stocks, public food stocks. Indeed, it was always a mystery to me why such huge stocks were allowed to be built up and sometimes leading to spoilage. But now that there's likelihood, as you say, of a below normal monsoon, now is the time to deploy those food stocks through open market sales or auctions and make sure that the prices and scarcity on the food grain front are contained, if not totally eliminated. And I think that's something that's very necessary to do. Exact phasing and timing is of course a matter which I leave to the experts. But he has the potential to do quite a bit there, and I think it'll be a real failure if nothing gets done.
While we're on
I think,
this...
going back to... Sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
Carry on, please carry on. I interrupted you. Carry on.
No, I said, I was going to say that I agree with what Mr. Bhattacharya said, that given what's going on in Iraq particularly, and it looks like it's going to be there, the problem's there for a while, that some more radical steps on the energy pricing issue is also going to be necessary.
Now, while we're talking about the steps that could be taken on the agricultural front, Dr. Archarya, do you think that this is an opportune moment to do two things? One, to not increase the minimum support price, or at least only increase it very marginally, because that is believed to be a major source of food inflation. And secondly, to amend the APMC Act and thus make it a lot easier for agricultural produce to be sold elsewhere from where it's grown in different mandis.
You know, I mean, I think in the short run, it's probably much more important what you do for the minimum support price, the procurement price, and that's what I would focus on. As to whether the APMC Acts in different states and so on need to be modified, some of them already have, you know, is more, I think, a medium-term issue. Certainly necessary, but I think right now I'd focus on, you know, the wheat crop is already in, so we're talking about the rice MSP, which is, I think, under normal circumstances due to be announced. And my hope is that what Mr. Ashok Gulati or Dr. Ashok Gulati would have recommended in his previous avatar as Chairman of Agricultural Prices and Costs would be either no change or a very modest increase, and I hope that the government will go with that. But I would also say one other thing, that at the same time that he's taking these hard decisions on in managing prices and energy issues and so forth, the subsidy issues, it would be important fairly soon, whether in the budget, shortly before or shortly after, to take some action to reduce the very restrictive provisions that we have in our labor laws, and of course
let me stop you. I'll come to those in a moment's time. Let me stop you. I'll come to those in a moment's time. I want to take up labor laws as a separate subject. I will definitely come to that. Let me, Dhruv Sawhney, come to measures that the Prime Minister needs to take to encourage investment, to use a phrase that Dr. Manmohan Singh used to love using, to fire up animal spirits. To what extent are you, as an industrialist, encouraged by speculation in the pink papers that he plans to raise FDI caps across the board to 49% with automatic clearance, and possibly in defense all the way to 100%? If those are actually realized and not just left as speculation, to what extent will that be a big boost to animal spirits?
Well, you know, there's two parts of it. There's the foreign investor and the domestic investor. Now, the domestic investor is not really going to be fired up that much by 100% FDI in defense. We in the private sector domestically haven't really been able to come into it ourselves. So to that extent, we look forward to it. But I think government expenditure on construction and actually moving things along, because the whole of industry, or the process industry, from the cement to the steel, they are not going ahead with their projects because they are not sure whether their final product is going to be sold. So this confidence has to change, and it's a chain reaction. So I think for domestic industry to get fired up, definitely he'll have to go a little further than just on the fuel price or doing something on the food. I think one of the areas which we're looking at is if he's more adventurous on public sector disinvestment, because that gives him the money to be able to do many other things, including the expenditure of government on defense or on health and education, which he's talked about, and spending money on infrastructure. So, you know, we are really very concerned about infrastructure and what you are going to talk about later, the labor laws. So I think industry is looking for those indicators in the budget very much.
Now, Mr. Bhattacharya, if FDI caps across the board are raised to 49, this could be a way of finessing the problem that the country has faced over insurance caps. And that's certainly one route that could bring in substantial sums of FDI. The catch there seems to be that whilst the government is speculating with raising FDI limits to 49 insurance, they may actually hold voting rights to 26, and they may also insist that at the same time every single company offers a standalone health insurance policy. Would those restrictions undermine the increase to 49, or do you think those restrictions wouldn't matter?
No, I don't think those restrictions will matter. Because even if you have 26% voting right, under the Indian laws, you have the veto power for the foreign investor. So, and making the health insurance package obligatory is part of an overall program of kind of corporate responsibility of an insurance company. So I don't think that will be much of a problem. But to believe that opening up the FDI laws or rules will solve your investment problem is, I think, is simplifying the real issue. The real problem which came in the way of increased investment in this country was not necessarily the FDI rules, but the absence of ease of doing business by domestic companies here. And I think if this budget has to send out a clear signal in terms of inviting and encouraging domestic investors to put their more money in new projects, then it has to improve the ease of doing business. And that, by that I mean not just the labor law changes, but also the taxation law changes. The tax terrorism that BJP manifesto talks about has to be addressed. You have to give a clear signal of introducing the goods and services tax, by which the kind of Inspector Raj that has prevailed in this country for years together, in spite of successive governments promising that the Inspector Raj would be abolished, that has not been done. So I think the overall, the ease of doing business has to be tackled to encourage the investment climate.
Now, James Crabtee, when we talk about improving ease of doing business and specifically talk about what Mr. Bhattacharya called tax terrorism, what jumps to mind, in fact, is the retrospective amendment of taxation undertaken by UPA, which hit not just Vodafone. Vodafone is only the best known example, but several other companies. Now, once again, there is speculation in the pink papers that the Modi government may actually amend in Parliament retrospective amendments on taxation and make them prospective instead, so that all the companies up to now affected would be released. If that were to happen, how would that go down with foreign investors?
I mean, to be honest, I think that's the single thing that he could do that would be most noticed around the world. The introduction of that retrospective amendment was massively damaging to international investor confidence. It wouldn't be an easy decision to roll it back unilaterally. It would be expensive. They'd lose the money they thought they'd get from Vodafone and a whole host of other companies. But I mean, I completely agree with your previous contributor that it isn't so much the openness of the Indian economy, it's the fact that it's incredibly difficult to do business in the Indian economy, not just for foreign investors, but for all of the Indian companies who spent the last 10 years increasingly making investments abroad rather than at home. And so Mr. Modi's task is not just to convince foreigners that India is the economy of the future, it's to convince Indian companies that India is the economy of the future and stop Tata investing in Britain or West Africa and to come back and invest in Pune or Calcutta. And to do that, this ease of doing business issue exemplified by tax is absolutely critical.
Now, let me take up that issue, Dr. Acharya, labour law reform that you wanted to raise a moment ago. Do you think Vasundhara Raje Scindia and the Rajasthan cabinet, by taking decisions themselves that affect just the state, have shown Mr. Modi the way forward? Or do you think that's too indecisive and too much of a patchwork quilt, and this issue needs to be tackled at the central level, not left to different states to do it when and if they're ready to go forward?
You know, it's quite possible that she was encouraged to do this as a trial balloon, but I don't know. But in any case, I think it's a good move on her part for the state of Rajasthan to kind of lead from the front. It's obviously much better, in my view, if essentially you go back to a system of labor laws which is, if you like, pre-Indira Gandhi. It's not that you don't have labor laws, that we just have extraordinarily restrictive ones, which are very destructive of job creation. And if you hope to create much more labor-intensive manufacturing in this country, you really can't do it, in my view, without making significant changes in existing labor laws, as well as, of course, reducing the onerous burden of the relatively new Land Acquisition Act, which has come into play in the last few months.
In fact, let me take up that Land Acquisition Act with you, Dhruv Sawhney. It's something that industrialists complain about enormously. They say not only does it make the acquisition of land extremely difficult, it also makes it extremely expensive. And it's something that, in fact, the BJP, if not in public, at least in private, has acknowledged and accepted. But do you think, both in terms of the Land Acquisition Bill, as well as in terms of labour law reform, that these are bullets this government will actually bite? Because both of them are politically very contentious. I know you hope they'll bite them, but do you think they will be bitten?
I think they will bite them. They are very conscious that these, just like James had mentioned about the retrospective taxation for foreign investment, these are two actual initiatives that we can get our hands on to get the confidence to start investing again. And I think both are very necessary for new investment. Without that, and along with GST, it's very difficult to get the rapid pace of growth that the economy wants to get back to 7-8%. So eventually, whether he does it in the next month or two, he will have to do it before the term is up, because you're not going to get the investment domestically that is needed for this 8-9% growth without land acquisition law being changed and the labor law being simplified. And I think we need to tackle it head on, not really with the Rajasthan model, which might be a trial balloon, but I think the earlier the Prime Minister can do it, the better.
Now, Mr. Bhattacharya, every newspaper believes that GST, if done and done quickly, could add anywhere between 1 and 2% to GDP growth. But the problem is that the BJP states were themselves the ones who held it up. Now that you have a BJP Prime Minister, do you think he'll knock his own party's heads together and drive some sense into them and force this through? Or do you think that the reverse could happen, that Congress chief ministers could now become the obstacle, just as the BJP ones were earlier on? Because after all, this is a constitutional issue and it does involve all the states.
Well, that is the short window of opportunity that the Narendra Modi government has. Right now, it is still in that honeymoon phase where the Congress chief ministers of the Congress party have not yet taken a very adversarial position vis-a-vis the BJP at the center. And I think this is a short window of opportunity where our understanding is that the finance ministry is working in close cooperation with all those BJP states, particularly in Madhya Pradesh and Gujarat, which had opposed the introduction of GST in the UPA regime, and some basic progress has been already been made. And I would not be surprised if some clear timetable is announced at the time Arun Jaitley presents his first budget, and maybe in the second week of July. So I think GST will definitely will make some movement forward, and I think Congress at this early days, 6 months, it will not create and scupper the GST proposal at this stage.
Now, James Crabtee, on the other issue that rankles with the industrialists, the delay in obtaining environmental clearances in particular, Prakash Javadekar, according to the Times of India, has suggested that he's going to institute a system of online environmental clearances in 60 days and a deemed clearance if it hasn't happened in 60 days flat. If that does happen, and I point out that it's only newspaper speculation at this moment, would that be very reassuring, and would people like POSCO and Vedanta, who've been stuck for years, breathe a huge sigh of relief?
Well, it sounds good, doesn't it? I mean, I'm not sure who could disagree with that. I mean, it sounds like the sort of thing people would like to hear. It's unclear to me whether that would actually make the biggest amount of difference. The most compelling analysis of the largest blocked projects suggests that almost all, or at least 3/4 of the delays happen at the state level. So much as with your previous contributor talking about the need for cooperation with the states on labor laws, if you're going to get these projects moving again, as opposed to something which might be useful or might be construed as a gimmick about online applications for environmental clearances, what he really needs to do is to use his connections, particularly with the BJP-led states, to have another go at this long list of stalled projects. It was nearly $400 billion worth of projects. The last government managed to get about a quarter of it done, something like 80 billion. So there's still $320 billion left. There are an awful lot of stalled projects out there, and I think it will probably take a little bit more than an online clearance system to get them moving again.
Now, Dr. Acharya, we're talking of measures, many of which actually require legislation. And whilst the Prime Minister has a clear majority in the Lok Sabha, he doesn't have one in the Rajya Sabha. There he's going to depend upon a patchwork of allies with no guarantee that they'll actually support everything he does. Swaminathan Iyer suggested in his article yesterday in the Times of India that rather than have to say on the issue of disinvestment, go back every single time when he wants legislative permission, he ought to pass an omnibus right to disinvestment bill, and if need be go through a joint session to do so, which would with one stroke take care of hassles of disinvesting banks, Coal India, HPCL, BPCL, or even the whole question of private permission for coal mining. Do you think an omnibus bill makes sense? And if it, would it be something that would again be an indication to industry and investors that there's seriousness here?
Well, if an omnibus bill of that nature is actually tenable from a legal point of view, I certainly think it makes economic sense. But I'm not so sure that it's tenable, but I'm not a legal expert at all, so I won't pretend to be. I just want to go back to one other point, that I think this government, the new government, sort of needs to recognize that not only has growth slowed down, inflation is high, external balances are not that wonderful, but that we are really in the dumps as far as industry and manufacturing is concerned. For 2 years running, we've had either zero or negative growth. And this hasn't happened, as far as I know, for about 25 or 30 years. And so it's not kind of a business as usual situation.
Okay.
And it's not just a question of trying to get back to 7-8% growth. It's a question of getting back to, 6.5. That's going to be a bit of a struggle unless you do some real hard things as far as reviving industry, manufacturing.
Gentlemen, we have very little time, so I'm going to ask you a couple of questions and ask you for really short, sharp answers. First, Dhruv Sawhney, how much time do you think the Prime Minister has to deliver? Most people believe he has a 100-day honeymoon. Most people believe that perhaps for the first 6 months he'd have a willing Parliament and perhaps a submissive opposition. Does he need to ensure that all these things are done within 6 months?
Absolutely. I think this critical time of 6 months is there to get the confidence moving. As Shankar said, we have come down to a very low level, especially in the capital goods and other manufacturing sectors. So unless there is that confidence coming back and people start investing or thinking of investing in the next 6 months, we will really turn the clock back and we won't get the growth in 15-16.
Okay.
So 6 months is the window that I feel is the maximum.
Mr. Bhattacharya, what happens if in fact the Prime Minister fails to bite the bullet effectively? After all, there are Haryana and Maharashtra elections on the horizon. The BJP believes it has a real chance to win them. Some of the measures could actually push up prices and annoy voters, particularly the middle class that is loyal. What if he starts delaying for political reasons? What will be the mood in industry? What will be the outcome for the economy? A quick answer, please.
Well, that would be bad news and a major disappointment, and which is why I believe that the budget will be a key indicator. And remember that budget is being presented in July, and if we cannot bite the bullet in budget, then I think we should say goodbye to brave major decisions that we discussed just now in the next 6 months, because you have state elections in November.
Okay.
So if he has a small window of opportunity, which is in budget, and budget will show that if he can do it or not.
How carefully and how acutely, James Crabtree, is the outside world watching Mr. Jaitley's first budget, which could be as just 2 or 3 weeks away?
I mean, I think people are watching Mr. Modi's progress very closely. And as your previous speaker said, he has an opportunity now. He has a thumping mandate He has an unprecedented majority. He has the chance to come in and do these things that the previous government simply weren't able to do. And I think people are watching very carefully as to whether or not he's going to do them, or whether or not, you know, he will act like the previous government did and play it safe, and ultimately then I think India will be the poorer.
All right, we have just about 3 weeks or maybe a little bit more to find out when the first budget happens, whether that bullet has been bitten, and then we'll wait to see whether in biting the bullet the government has damaged its teeth, or whether in fact it's done a Superman act and got away with it. My thanks to all 4 of my guests for joining me.